welcome to this webinar. This is part of the Ohio Watershed Network webinar series, and our speaker today is Merritt Frey. Merritt is with River Network, a national nonprofit that focuses on assisting watershed groups. And Merritt is the Habitat Program Director with River Network. She's based in Salt Lake City, Utah. She has 15 years of experience with the Clean Water Act at both the federal and state levels. And she's been focusing on water quality standards, 401 water quality certification, pollution control permits, habitat restoration, drinking source water protection, TMDLs. Did I leave anything out, Merritt?
That's the high points.
It kind of covers the gamut, doesn't it? Yeah. And Merritt today is going to be talking about Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, which probably in most states, certainly in Ohio, is one of the most important sections of the Clean Water Act in terms of watershed protection, because it focuses on protecting important wetlands and streams, and also requires mitigation when those wetlands and streams are modified. And so Merritt's going to talk about how we can, knowing about that section of the Clean Water Act, and how people can participate in protecting rivers and watersheds by being involved in that permitting process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Merritt.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Joe. I'm happy to be here today to talk about the Clean Water Act and specifically the 404 program. A little background here, as Joe mentioned, I work for a group called River Network, which is a national alliance of watershed groups all around the country. And our mission is to empower and unite people and communities to protect and restore rivers and other waters in their area that will help sustain the health of their community and our country, as well as those important water resources. We were founded back in 1998, and our basic job is to help watershed and river groups and others interested in water issues do what they do better. So we work with groups around the country on issues ranging from strengthening your fundraising abilities, writing good grants, say, or having a successful major donor program, to using tools like the Clean Water Act, which we'll talk about today, to better protect or restore your watershed. So our job is really just to help groups do what they do better. If you're interested in what we do, you can go to www.rivernetwork.org for more information and tools like the kinds of things we'll be talking about today to help you with policy tools, again, fundraising, volunteer programming, all kinds of things that watershed and river groups might find useful. For today's session, we are going to focus in on the Clean Water Act and the 404 program, as Joe mentioned. This is designed to be a 101 session, so very much an introductory session. So hopefully we'll try to define, if not minimize, the use of jargon. We're already talking about the 404 program, so clearly jargon is not completely avoidable, but we'll try to give you the background to help you wade through that jargon. We are going to touch on a few issues that are a little more intermediate, say a 201 level, but again, we're going to just touch on those in the hopes of giving you a feel for some of the other issues that are out there that as you get more comfortable with this program, you would want to better understand and dig in on a little bit, and we'll provide some resources at the end to help you do that. So with that, let me jump in here to our agenda for this session. As a 101 session, I like to always start with a little bit of an introduction to the Clean Water Act itself. This will be pretty brief, but just to give you a little context for the program we'll be talking about today, we'll talk a bit about the Clean Water Act itself. And then we'll dive right into the basics of the feature program for today, the 404 program from within the Clean Water Act. Talk through some of the basics of that program, and then we'll talk about some special issues related to the 404 program. This is where we'll touch on some issues that might be a little more intermediate or complicated, but they're important things to at least understand are out there as you start to get involved with a program like this. So we'll just walk through 4 issues that everyone should be aware of and give you some ideas again for where you might dig a little deeper on some of those topics as you dive in. Next, we're going to talk about public involvement. One of the reasons that River Network focuses on the Clean Water Act is that it has really pretty amazing public involvement requirements built into pretty much every program of the Act, including the 404 program. So we want to really stress that today, because as watershed coordinators and other people involved in your community, it really does offer a way for your opinions and ideas to be incorporated into what's happening with wetlands and stream alterations in your watershed. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit more about ideas for engaging in these issues and these resources where you can dig a little deeper and learn a little bit more, maybe take those first steps beyond a 101 session. So that's our agenda for today. I'm going to dive right into the introduction, and we will have some spots for questions and clarification throughout this session as we go. But we'll start with this basic introduction to kind of orient ourselves. So as I mentioned, I like to set the stage a little bit by talking about the Clean Water Act itself. The Act is huge and both very complicated and relatively simple. So we could talk about the Clean Water Act generally in this introduction for hours. I'm just going to give you a little bit of context here. So I always like to start with the Clean Water Act's objective. This is the overall driving point of our national policy, our national law on water quality issues. And you'll see it says the objective of the Act is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's water. So a couple of reasons I put this up is it's a great reminder that this is a really sweeping and broad law that we'll be working within when we talk about the 404 program. We often think about the Clean Water Act and its kind of water quality goals in terms of chemical water pollution, maybe heavy metals or other kind of scary things that you dip a beaker into a stream and you sample for. And it certainly is about that kind of pollution, the chemical pollution that can be pretty intense, and it really drove a lot of the interest in establishing the Clean Water Act back in the 1970s. But it's not limited to that. It also is about the physical and biological integrity of our waters. And that's very important when we're talking about things like we will today, like wetlands, dredge and fill kind of projects, or stream alteration, where we're really getting at the physical and biological components of our river and lakes and wetland systems. So that's important to keep in mind. Two other topics that I'd like to touch on here, just to give you some context, is that making the point that the Clean Water Act is our national approach to protecting and restoring our water resources. But within that national structure, a lot of the day-to-day work of implementing the law is really done by the states, and in some cases even more local governments. But the states play a huge role. In the Clean Water Act language, this is called a delegated kind of activity. So in a lot of instances, although the federal law sets this national kind of system of protection and the U.S. EPA oversees that system, the states may be interpreting and implementing those programs at the local level. For those of you who are used to working within the Clean Water Act, an example of that would be the Water Quality Standards Program, where U.S. EPA sets the kind of standards for how your water quality standards are developed and implemented, but the states really interpret and apply those at the local level. You will see that this is true for the program we're talking about today, to some extent, also a little bit different for the 404 program. The other broad point on the Clean Water Act to keep in mind is that the Clean Water Act establishes kind of a national floor of protection. It's by no means the ceiling of protection. So we have these kind of national standards that are established and monitored by U.S. EPA and in some cases other agencies, but the states are free to do more or better than that national floor. And we'll actually see an example here where Ohio, in the wetlands context, has established a program of their own that really takes protection out farther to additional waters. And so we'll see an example of that idea of the Act as a floor as we talk through the slides today. One other general slide here, and this is, again, just as background, is to put anything we talk about in terms of the Clean Water Act in the context of the Clean Water Act goals. We just talked about its objective, but it's worth remembering that in the Act there also are a series of goals. I've just paraphrased three of them here that are most relevant to what we'll be talking about today. You'll see when you look at these goals that they're pretty bold and pretty specific. They have dates, at least in terms of the first two, by which they'd like these goals to be achieved. But, again, they're quite bold. All waters should be safe for fishing and swimming by 1983. The elimination of pollution discharged to water by 1985. You can look at these in two ways. One is, kind of inspiring, very bold, or two, a little bit disheartening because those deadlines have come and gone, and we clearly haven't eliminated all discharge of pollution to waters. But these are still our national goals, and the fact that they're quite bold should inspire us as we work on these programs to kind of push our envelope out a little bit for what we're trying to achieve for our waters and for public health and the health of our aquatic ecosystems. So just as context, remember that the Act really does have a very strong vision of protection and restoration for our waters. So with that, we'll kind of move on from the general to drilling down to a little more specifics here on what we're going to be talking about today. So this is just a snippet from the Act itself, from Section 404. So to define the jargon Joe and I have been using here, Section 404 is just the area of the Clean Water Act where the program that gets at wetland, dredge and fill activities, and stream alteration permitting is housed. So when we talk about the 404 program, that's just shorthand for this program that addresses those issues. So one main thought to take away from this slide is what the Act did was not ban all wetlands filling nor stream alteration. What it did was say you can't undertake those activities without having a permit and without complying with that permit. So it doesn't make it illegal to do it. It makes it illegal to do it without a permit or to do it in a way that violates that permit once you have one. So it's just a different way to think about it, very similar to pollution discharge permits, where if you're familiar with kind of wastewater treatment or industrial facility permitting, the Act said you can discharge pollutants, but you need to do it in compliance with a permit. And what those permits do, we'll see as we talk about them, is give us a way to get a handle on how these activities are done, where they're done, what time periods they're done, a lot of those kind of details. And they also trigger these public involvement requirements that give people a chance to weigh in on how those activities are done and if they're done and where. You can see even in this snippet it talks about issuing the permits after public hearings, notice and comment, and the opportunity for a hearing. So it's built right into the fundamental language of the Act that watershed kind of interests have a voice and a role in this process. So let's get a little bit deeper here into 404 then. The 404 program is a pretty complicated program. In this 101 session, what I'd like to do is cover some very basic questions. What is regulated, who's involved, what types of permits generally are out there, and then what do those permits require. So we're going to walk through each of those four questions. So getting at the first, what is regulated? We've already kind of touched on this in just our introductory discussion. But the thing to remember is that what is regulated is this activity of discharging dredge or fill material into any water of the U.S. And again, it doesn't bar the activity. It makes it illegal to do it without a permit or, again, to violate your permit once you have one of those. So we'll talk about exemptions later, but generally speaking, if you're going to be moving, earth and dredging, or dredging to move the earth or filling waters with any kind of material, that would trigger this this program. We'll also talk a little bit about what a water of the United States is. These are getting into some of those intermediate special issues I mentioned, but generally, the concept of into any water body of the U.S. One point to make here is that for shorthand, the 404 program is often referred to as the wetlands program or wetlands permitting. You hear people refer to it in shorthand in that way. But it's important to remember that it's not just about wetlands, it's also about stream alteration activities. So if somebody's referring to, the wetlands program or 404, just keep in mind that it does address both kinds of activities. It's really about this broader group of the waters of the United States, so not just wetlands. So we'll circle back around to some of these issues on the details of what is regulated when we talk about the special issues, but that's the general idea. The who is involved is kind of a complicated question here compared to some other Clean Water Act programs, and it's a little bit different. Usually what you find in Clean Water Act structures is that US EPA is kind of the lead federal agency. They set these kind of guidelines or regulations that establish this national floor for a program, and then a lot of the work, as I mentioned earlier, is delegated to the states to implement. The 404 program is generally a little bit different. That structure still exists in part, but the Army Corps of Engineers is the day-to-day lead agency. So rather than the U.S. EPA kind of setting that structure, the Army Corps largely does the day-to-day structural work of implementing the permit program. However, US EPA is still involved in the program quite heavily. They retain the ability to review activities, permits, regulations, etc., and they provide oversight. They also have guidance that they issue to help define issues and debates within the program. So they're an active participant. They're not just the day-to-day lead, though, that the Army Corps is in this case. The states do have a role in the program as well. They can be delegated authority to run the program themselves. Like in a lot of other Clean Water Act programs, there's a mechanism in the Act that allows the state to take on the program. However, unlike other programs, only 2 states have taken over the 404 program, Michigan and New Jersey. So in most other programs, it's all or a very high percentage of the states. For example, the Water Quality Standards Program is something that all the states have taken on to run on their own. The Pollution Discharge Permit Program, all but just a small handful of states have taken over. 404 program is kind of different. But even when your state has not taken on the program, there is a role for your state, and we'll talk a little bit more about each of these. But the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency there in Ohio can weigh in on wetlands and stream alteration permits, 404 permits, through a process called the 401 Water Quality Certification that allows them to review and place conditions on or even deny these federal permits. We'll talk more about that. And as I've already kind of mentioned, your agency has a program that addresses isolated wetlands that allows them to permit activities in a certain subset of waters that might otherwise not be covered under the Clean Water Act federal program. So we'll talk about both of those state-specific functions more in later in the presentation. In addition, though, there's other agencies that get involved with different issues that relate to these wetlands permits and the debates that go on around them. We won't talk about this in detail, but it's worth knowing that agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or your state DNR may get involved with different kinds of issues that come up. The Fish and Wildlife Service, for example, if there's threatened or endangered species at issue, that would be a place where they would weigh in. Again, that's a little bit more of an intermediate to advanced topic, but it's good to know that that is a function of those agencies in case it comes up. So a little bit more detail here on the Army Corps of Engineers as the who for the Wetlands Permitting Program. If you haven't worked with the Army Corps of Engineers before, it's a little bit different than working with your state agency or even the US EPA because of the way they're set up and the way that they kind of run their business. One challenge of engaging with the Army Corps is that their structure doesn't follow traditional state boundaries. So the Corps is divided into divisions, which are kind of large areas. They're further divided into districts, smaller areas within the divisions. And you can see from this map that some states are in multiple divisions and can be kind of confusing even at that large scale level. Luckily for Ohio, you all are completely located within the Great Lakes and Ohio River Division. So that simplifies things in terms of who you talk to or websites to visit, etc., a little bit for you all. So in terms of division, you're all within the Great Lakes and Ohio River Division. It gets a little more complicated for you, though, when you get to the district level, which is where a lot of the day-to-day activities like issuing public notice on permits, etc., will come up. So this is a not very good quality map, but the best I could find, that shows the districts in Ohio. The important thing here is that this central area of the state, which is covered in light blue, is the Huntington District of the Army Corps of Engineers. So the majority of the state is covered by the Huntington District. But it does, again, it is a little complicated because that eastern slice is covered by the Pittsburgh district, the western by the Louisville district, and the northern slice by the Buffalo district. So I'll put up some websites at the end of the presentation, and depending on where you are and what, where your watershed is, you may have to figure out which district you need to work with in terms of, say, signing up for public notices like we'll talk about. And you may need to even be in contact with several districts depending on if your watershed straddles some of their service areas. So most of you, though, will be covered by the Huntington district, and the others will have to kind of sort out where those exact boundaries are. Again, I'll put up some websites at the end that'll connect you better with your districts. So then moving on from the who to the what types of permits exist, there's a lot of different ways we could slice the types of permits that exist. This is the very most basic. And if you're familiar with the Clean Water Act Pollution Discharge Permit Program, you might be familiar with these concepts. If not, this might be new territory, so I thought it was worth putting up there. Within this 404 permit program, there's two generic types of permits, individual and general. So individual permits are probably what most people think of when they think of requiring permits for something like a wetland fill project or a stream alteration project. In the case of individual permits, it's just like what it sounds like. Each discharge or activity would have its own permit, and that permit would be individually designed to address the specifics of the project. So it would have perhaps its own limitations on, say, timing or size of the alteration project. It might have very specific best management practices designed to address the project itself or particular issues in the creek, say, that's having the stream alteration project. It might have site-specific monitoring requirements to really get at, say, a specific concern with a species in the stream or something that's site-specific. Importantly, these individual permits also have individual public notice and comment opportunity. So we'll talk a little bit more and look at actually a public notice, but in the case of an individual permit, you would, as a member of the public, be able to receive an individual notice that this is being proposed and then weigh in on the specifics of that proposed project. In contrast, a general permit is quite a different creature. So a general permit is one permit that's written to be able to cover a variety of projects. Should be one type of project, not every project under the sun, but for example, a general permit might address, using a stream alteration example, utility line crossings on a stream. Might say, well, if we have hundreds of these utility line crossing proposals that come before us, and we're going to write one general permit that has kind of cookie-cutter requirements in terms of limitations on the size of the impact, best management practices that should always be in place for these utility line crossings, and some general monitoring requirements that are applicable to that type of activity. So think of them as a way to get a lot of permit applications covered with one effort by the state agency, this general permit. These permits are often used because they reduce the workload for an agency. So say the Army Corps of Engineers, they issue this one general permit, and then they just allow people to be covered under it. They don't have to write a permit each time one of these projects comes in. It also, another pro of this approach is consistent. It provides consistency for an applicant, so they kind of know if they're going to do utility line crossing, these are the kinds of things that are going to be required on each time they do a project. Some of the cons from a conservation perspective or a public perspective is a general permit is put out for public notice when it's written, so when that first generic permit is produced, and when it's renewed, which is usually every 5 years or so. But it is not sent out for public comment when a project actually is applied for. So if that general permit has already been out for public comment, it's been approved, and then a project is proposed in your watershed that might qualify for coverage under the general permit, you might not have any chance to provide public notice and input in an official way on that project. So from a conservation perspective, that is challenging because you don't get a chance to really see those projects and weigh in the way we'll talk about for other projects. So looking at this in a little more specifically, in Ohio, the Army Corps of Engineers, which is, again, the lead agency on these permits, has a mix of permit options that they can use. They have a type of general permit called a nationwide permit, and there's actually 51 different versions of this nationwide permit, again, looking at different activities. So utility lines is actually an example of a category of nationwide permit. Stream alteration projects actually have a nationwide permit. There's a general permit, as we discussed. So there's a variety of these activities that can be covered under a nationwide permit that's a general permit. The Army Corps also has another general permit that is a regional permit covering the state. So it's not national, but it's for the state. That it covers the Department of Transportation. That's what the DOT there stands for. So Department of Transportation projects can get these kind of general coverage approaches done by using this regional permit. And then they also, of course, have individual permits that get issued that are these site-specific kind of permits. In addition to the Army Corps, of course, I've mentioned that your Ohio Environmental Protection Agency has its own permitting program that we'll talk a little bit more about, and that is the Isolated Wetlands Permit Program. And those permits vary. There's some general permits that cover a lot of activities, and then there is also some areas where individual permits are required. And I'll show you a little chart that kind of breaks that out from your state agency. So that's how that general versus individual permit coverage kind of breaks out in Ohio. So let's wrap up. I think this is the last question for the very, very basics, and then we'll switch to some of these special issues. I think the last question we wanted to walk through is what is required. So they have to get a permit. What does that really mean? And again, because this is a 101 session, I'm going to walk you through the very basic concept of what's required. There's so much to learn about what is in these permits and what should be in the permits that sometimes is missing. But what we're going to cover today here is kind of the very basic core thrust of the permitting program. And even that can be a challenge to get incorporated into the permits. So I'm going to walk through three steps that are meant to be undertaken for any wetland permit that is contemplated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers under this Clean Water Act program. And these steps are meant to be done in order. And the concept of these steps you'll hear referred to as sequencing. So that's kind of a jargon piece that might come up if you're talking to the agency or others. By sequencing, all we mean is that every time a project is designed and then comes forward for permitting under the 404 program, they're supposed to first avoid harm. So they're supposed to demonstrate that there's no practical alternatives to what's being proposed. Second, for harm that can't be avoided, applicants are supposed to minimize the harm. And so in the application process, they should demonstrate how it is that that harm was minimized. What do they do to minimize it? And then lastly, for things that can't be avoided and can't be minimized away, how does the project mitigate those unavoidable impacts or harm? Those are supposed to trigger mitigation, which means kind of replacing the values that have been lost. So if you're filling a piece of wetland or altering a stream bank, how do you make sure that in another place you're kind of balancing that out? That's a horrible layperson way to put it, but that's the general idea, is replacing the values that are lost. So again, the important thing to remember here is these three steps and that they're meant to be done in order. There does seem to be a tendency to want to skip to step 3 without really working on steps 1 or 2, or at least not fully documenting those. So I'm going to talk about each of these steps in a little more detail here. And again, there's lots and lots of information behind each of these steps, and it can get quite complicated. But generally, when we're talking about avoiding, we're talking about in a project proposal, the applicant should demonstrate that there are no practicable alternatives. So as a watershed coordinator or a member of the public, if you're looking at their proposal, you should be able to understand why it is that the losses, say a wetland fill or so hardening of a stream bank, needs to be done outside of any other kind of practicable alternative. So to do that, the applicant is supposed to prove the discharge is unavoidable, and that they have chosen to take the path of the least degrading practicable alternative to achieve the basic purposes of their project. So you can see in looking at this language, there is a lot of room for interpretation and debate in any of these terms. What's truly unavoidable, what's the least degrading alternative, and what's practicable can tie us up in knots. And this is where a lot of the public comment and input can help define what we mean by those terms for any given project. The other thing that is important that I'll just touch on here is this: to achieve the basic purposes of the project or purpose of the project. One thing that I've really noticed as we talk about avoiding and minimizing harm especially is if your project purpose, which is just kind of, the goal of what an applicant is trying to do, whether it's develop a housing development or stabilize a stream bank or what have you, the way that's written is really important. If the project purpose is so narrow that only one alternative is practicable, it might be going back and looking at the purpose and saying, well, is that purpose right, or is the purpose more general? And then we can, in fact, have a wider range of options for what we want to achieve. But to dive into just a little more detail here on what some of this language means, when we say that the applicant needs to demonstrate there are no practicable alternatives, there is a little bit of advice out there, rules of thumb for defining that practicable. It does generally need to achieve the basic project purpose. Again, though, that's why it's important to properly define what that purpose is, and that's a good role for the public in terms of public comment. It does have to be not unreasonably costly. I can't give you an exact number for what unreasonably costly means, but you will find as you start to have these discussions that you want to be talking about economic realities as well as technological realities. You often hear that if it's something that involves like a different piece of property or a different use of a property, it needs to be something that is owned by or available to the applicant. So you can't just say, well, they could move their development to the neighboring county if there's no property available there that would serve their purpose. It's not okay to just say they should do it somewhere else. It has to be, again, something that is achievable within the constructs of the project. And then, again, this generic feasible, which is really hard to define, and, again, leaves a lot of room for public input and discussion. So that's very general on avoidance, but you can see it does give a lot of room for interpretation by the local public about what is feasible and practicable in the context of what people want for their community and their watershed. But if you assume that it's a certain piece or amount of the harm that we're looking at isn't avoidable, let's say it's putting in a waterfront development dock or something that really needs to be done, there's going to be some kind of impact to the resource. The project applicant doesn't just get to kind of walk away once they've said they can't avoid that harm. They have to also minimize it. So in the application, they should demonstrate how that's been done. And that needs to take into account clearly a whole lot of factors, the location of the project, the nature of what they're proposing to do, what kinds of things can be done to protect plant and animal species. This is really where you can get at a lot of the subtleties of how things are designed and put into place on the ground. This is, again, getting a little more advanced, but I've given a citation here to a section of the regulations that kind of establish the structure for this program, where there's a lot more information about how minimization can be approached and how it should be documented. But again, think of this as, how can you design a project to have the smallest footprint and the best management in place to minimize any kind of harm? And again, this is a place where public input can be really valuable. So this is not a perfect scan. This is as good as my technology could do, but this is actually from a wetland 404 permit in Ohio from the Army Corps of Engineers, and this is the extent of their coverage of the first two steps of sequencing, so avoidance and minimization. A couple things to notice here. I've got a box here around the alternatives or avoidance kind of language. So you see here they say that alternative plans were considered, including alternate locations for the facility. And then they say they're unavoidable due to the necessity, kind of where it needs to be to accomplish what they're trying to do. And this may well be very true. If you're a member of the public, though, the very first thing I would want to do is get a hold of what kinds of alternative locations were considered, and do I have thoughts either on why those shouldn't have been disregarded, or other alternative locations that weren't considered, or perhaps maybe it's not just locations, maybe there's different types of treatment or facility that could be put in place that just wouldn't have had the same kind of impact or harm, and hence would have avoided what we're talking about doing here in terms of the stream impacts. So very short and brief here in the permit, and just kind of begs for more information. And in terms of minimization, they do, again, talk about it here in the last section. And they say it's been designed to minimize impacts by avoiding impacts to the lower part of the stream, et cetera. And again, if this was a project you were concerned about, you might just want to get a little more information. Maybe in the designs you'll be able to see how they were designed to avoid this impact, but also see if there's additional work that could be done in order to, say, move the location or redesign the size of the facility. Those are the kinds of things that can be helpful. And you don't necessarily have to be an engineer on these. A lot of it is about asking questions and sharing ideas, creative ideas for how things can be done with a smaller footprint or better best management practices. But so there's your example of avoidance and minimization in a real-world permit. The last step in sequencing, or what should be the last step, is mitigation. So if you've avoided everything you could and then you've minimized everything that's left, you still have this third step of mitigation, which basically says, we're going to try to replace the values that have been lost, say if we filled in a wetland area. And this snippet here is just a little example of the kinds of language you'll see when people talk about mitigation. It talks about restoring, enhancing, or in some cases preserving resources, again, to offset the unavoidable adverse impacts that have been set up in a project proposal. Mitigation is a really complicated issue. And you'll see a lot of debate around just the feasibility of mitigation, the long-term success of mitigation. It's not quite as simple as it sounds to replace the values that are lost when you fill a wetland or alter a stream. So I've provided a little link here to a page on the Ohio EPA's website with more information about mitigation. It's a pretty complicated issue, but it's worth really doing a little bit of additional research on if this is an area you're going to work. For now, though, the important thing to remember is that this third step says that mitigation is required. And when we talk about public input, some of the things that you can do as a watershed coordinator or other type of interested party is ask to see what kind of mitigation they're proposing and long-term follow up to make sure it's done and that it's successful. So here's an example of a place where I think public input could be helpful. This is from the same permit from Ohio, and this is the third step section in the permit, the mitigation. And what they say here is that the applicant is proposing to compensate, so mitigate for unavoidable impacts. And they kind of generally say it through erosion control and other off-site mitigation measures, but there's no information about what exactly is it that they're proposing to do and where and when, and how does that replace the values that may be lost. So I think that this would be a great role in terms of citizen involvement to ask those questions and request, some sort of plan or detailed approach, and then to follow up and make sure it happens and see if it actually does replace those values over time. That might be as easy as going out to see if these kind of mitigation measures have actually been implemented, or as complicated as volunteer monitoring measures to try to see what the impact of these measures are over time. So that is the basic introduction to 404. A lot of information there. I will open it up, Joe, for any kind of clarifying questions, anything that needs to be better defined here before we move into our special issues.
Okay. would like a clarification. You mentioned quite a bit activities that would be covered by the 404 section referring to filling or discharge, but what about if you're removing material, say from wetlands or streams? What is covered? And yeah, so maybe if you could just give some examples of activities that would not necessarily involve filling wetlands or streams, but maybe taking materials out.
It's actually a pretty complicated question, or a pretty complicated answer, but I'll give you the general answer and then caveat it by saying that this is something where if you're pursuing this kind of angle, you probably would want to do a lot more research and legal research to really define the type of activity you're talking about. But an example might be, if somebody is digging a ditch to drain a wetland, right? Like, so they're not filling it, but they're going to drain that wetland. It removes the wetland. It's gone afterwards. Is that covered? And the generic answer is that what has been found generally is that if you're doing that kind of activity, there usually is incidental fill. Things will be falling back into the wetland as you're digging that channel, say that drainage area or what have you. And so that kind of activity would still require a permit. But there are some fine lines and details and things that people probably should be aware of. Say if you see an activity that you believe should trigger this, it's always worth calling your agency and asking, because generally speaking, again, these kinds of activities would be covered. But it's important to know that there are some subtleties involved in how that's interpreted. Does that help, Joe? It's pretty broad, but know that there could be caveats to that.
Yeah, I think probably one of the most common examples that we might see in Ohio is where you've got a natural channel, maybe with a lot of vegetation, trees and shrubs growing along the bank, and in an agricultural area, for example, and the landowner wants to change that natural meandering stream to a straight drainage ditch. So the first part of that activity might be to cut down the trees and shrubs along the stream. The second part then might be to pull the banks back and change the geometry of the stream so that it's straighter. Maybe you could just comment on that and what or if might fall under the 404.
Sure. Yeah, in that example, that natural channel, again, the program is not just about wetlands, but about, the physical and biological integrity of the waters of the U.S. So a natural channel that's covered by the Clean Water Act would be protected. In the twofold example you gave there, under, say, a 404 kind of context, most likely, I suppose there's scenarios where the way they do it could change this, but most likely, cutting down the trees, et cetera, that first phase would not trigger a Clean Water Act kind of review. There might be other local ordinances or buffer requirements, et cetera, that would be a problem for, but perhaps not a 404 permit. The second part, though, where you're changing the geometry and the structure of the creek, would, I'm going to talk about exemptions in a minute, but would almost always trigger these kinds of requirements for the stream alteration aspect of that work. Does that help? So maybe not step A, but step B.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Anything else?
Nope. That's it.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm just going to touch relatively quickly here on some of these 201 or intermediate issues that I mentioned. The general theme for these are just that these are things I want even a 101 audience to be aware of, and that you'll probably learn more about as you wade into this world. And again, I'll try to provide a little bit of references here to help you do that as you move forward. The four issues that I've identified as kind of key here are cumulative impacts of multiple kind of permitted activities, exemptions. I've touched on that a few times, so I want to run through it. This isolated wetlands questions, or your Ohio program, and then the concept of 401 water quality certification, or your state's role in reviewing these permits. So first off, cumulative impacts. We often get this question of, well, each individual permit that I look at doesn't seem so bad. It's just a little bit of alteration or, a tiny piece of a wetland. But when I look at the cumulative impacts in my watershed, it's kind of death by a thousand cuts. And that is, a very real reality in a lot of watersheds across the country. And the 404 program does attempt to address that reality. The way it's implemented, though, is really short of the mark, and it's another good place where, as someone who maybe has a broader view of what's going on in a watershed, a member of the public or a watershed group can really have an important role. So the take-home message here, I've given you the citation to what's called the 404B1 guidelines. How's that for jargon? Which is, again, kind of the regulatory structure piece of the program. The Act itself in 404 and then in those regulations, which I have a cite for here, the idea of cumulative impacts is required to be addressed. So it says that you should be able to look at cumulative impacts that could be predicted to the extent reasonable and practicable. Now, the way that plays out, again, is pretty challenging. In practice, meaningful review of cumulative impacts in a watershed is, to be harsh, kind of rare to non-existent. So again, it's a good role for citizens and watershed groups. As an example, here in Utah years ago when I worked at the state level, we looked at the use of just one general permit in one watershed here in the state and really found that it was being used over and over and over and over again in a way that was really having a cumulative impact on what wetlands were available in the watershed and on the stream itself in terms of stream alterations along the river. So it's just an important concept to keep in mind and know that there are kind of rules and regulations that allow you to make a case for the agency to not just look at the one activity that's in front of them, but to look at, hey, over the last 10 years or 20 years in this watershed, what has been the impact of all these different permitted kind of losses of wetland or changes to the stream itself. So that is an important thing to keep in mind, although challenging to address. Also important to keep in mind is exemptions. So we've been talking in very general terms about these dredge and fill activities, as Joe pointed out. It's like, well, what is covered, what's not? This is a list, a kind of paraphrasing of a list of exemptions. So these are generally the types of activities that may be exempted from requirements for a wetland permit. The asterisk on the exemptions there is that this is my paraphrasing of long, long language from Section 404 of the Act. So this does not mean that every maintenance activity ever is exempted from 404 permitting. So just to translate, what I've called maintenance activities here in the law says exempted activities for the purpose of maintenance, including emergency reconstruction of recently damaged parts of serviceable structures such as dikes, dams, levees, groins, rip-rap, breakwaters, causeway, and bridge abutments or approaches and transportation structures. So you can see that that list is really focused on emergency reconstruction, etc. So a maintenance activity may or may not be exempted. Ditto for ongoing farming, ranching, and forestry practices. There's a list of things that are examples of the types of kind of ongoing normal farming activities that might be exempted, but by no means are all farming activities exempted. And ditto for the rest of this list. So just know that if you're looking at an activity like this, you may need to go look in more detail to see, well, is this particular farming activity something that might be exempted, or is a permit required? So just be aware of these, and again, know that there's a place to go in the law. It's Section 404 that will provide you with more specifics, or just ask your state agency staff. They'll be very familiar with these types of exemptions and can help you kind of navigate them. Again, if in doubt, ask is always the best rule of thumb on these. The third issue I wanted to touch on is probably the most complicated issue relating to the topic we're talking about today, so I'm only going to briefly touch on it. But it's this idea of isolated waters. I've mentioned several times that Ohio has a program that looks at isolated wetlands. And this program kind of comes out of Supreme Court decisions in the early 2000s that created confusion about which waters are protected under the Clean Water Act. This is, two cases that really changed the way we thought we understood what was protected. Since that time, US EPA has been working on guidance and regulations to clarify what's covered. Those guidance and rules still are not available to us today or to your state as they try to figure out which waters are protected. So in this void of kind of confusing void of what's covered, what's not, your state, Ohio, established what they call the Isolated Wetland Permit Program that allows them to make sure that in those cases where there's wetlands that may be what the Supreme Court, deemed possibly not covered by the Clean Water Act, your state has a program that kind of fills that confusion gap and covers and protects some of those places. So it's important to know that that exists and that there's this whole other kind of sister program that might be covering activities in your watershed or a particular question that you have about is that activity supposed to be permitted. So a little bit more on your state program. So what your state program does is just say this program covers a wetland that is not subject to regulation under the Clean Water Act, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act is its official name. And it sets up 3 levels of review for those types of permits for different types of wetlands, and I'll touch on that briefly. So it's great that your state has this program. It does give you a little bit more to learn about in terms of tracking the permits, but I've provided a link here to the agency's website on the Isolated Wetlands Permit Program, and your agency does a pretty good job of sharing information on how they're doing this, what's covered, etc. So if you have this type of issue in your watershed, you should really start there and then talk to the state agency staff. But just generically, to give you an idea, what Ohio has done is they've established three categories of wetlands and then set up a different permitting levels of review based on what category of wetland and what size of wetland is under question with a permit application. So that your categories of wetlands are 1, 2, and 3, and the state ranks them based on the quality of the wetland and the functionality of the wetland. And you can see from this chart that wetlands that are in Category 1 generally receive a general permit, or in some cases where it's a large wetland, they get an individual permit with a reduced level of review. So there's lots of details that go into this, but basically if it's a higher quality, higher functioning wetland, it's going to receive an individual permit with those types of individual public comment, etc., and a higher level of review, whereas if it's a wetland, a smaller wetland, and a wetland with maybe a slightly less quality, less functionality, it's going to get more of the general permit, less review kind of category. And again, the agency's website walks through what is meant by these categories as well as the level of review and what the different levels of review mean. In my opinion, probably one of the most important differences between the different levels of review is the amount of public notice and input that's required. There's less public notice and input required for level 1 review than for level 3. Level 2 is kind of in the middle. So those are there's one more special issue to cover here, and that's 401 Water Quality Certification, an issue near and dear to my heart. This is another way that your state gets involved, and another way that you can get involved is by engaging with your state in this process. We do a whole webinar on 401 certification in and of itself, but just in shorthand, 401 certification allows your state, the state of Ohio, to review a federal permit, which would include a 404 permit. It's coming from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It's a federal permit. So they get to review those and make sure that they're not going to violate your state water quality standards or any other kind of relevant protections. So you can think of it as kind of a check and balance approach. The Army Corps of Engineers proposes a permit in Ohio. Ohio gets to kind of review it. And when Ohio reviews it, they get to do one of 4 things. And it's pretty powerful, this list of 4 things that they can do. So if the Army Corps proposes a permit, your state can certify the project. They can just say, yes, this is a good project. We think it'll comply with our standards and other rules, and the project moves forward. They can certify it, but place conditions on the project. So the state could require specific best management practices be put in place. It could require more monitoring. different reporting. There's all kinds of conditions that your state could put in place to say, we need this to be done to make sure that this activity complies with our rules and standards. They could outright deny certification, which means the permit cannot move forward. So the Army Corps proposes a permit, your state reviews it and says, nope, there's no way that this could move forward and comply with our standards. They deny it. That permit is essentially dead, for want of a better word. Or the state can waive its certification if they don't take any of the first three actions within a certain time frame. The certification is just waived and the project moves forward. So you can see this is pretty powerful. It's not something that the federal agency, the Army Corps, could ignore. And if the state either places conditions on a project or denies it, the Corps has to incorporate those conditions or accept the denial. The project applicant could change the proposal to address the concerns and come back, but it isn't something that can just be ignored and allow the permit to move forward as is. So with that, Joe, any clarifying questions before we move into public involvement?
No, Merritt, you did a really good job of covering that section. It was a really nice summary, and I didn't have any questions come up.
Well, good. I like to hear that. The 401 certification, though, we've joked about maybe doing a whole webinar on that with you guys, and if there's interest, it could be a good place to spend a little time. But with that, I'll move on here to the public notice quickly. Some of this we've already touched on, so we'll be able to move through it relatively quickly. But the important thing to keep in mind, again, is that the Act is great in terms of requiring public involvement, and the 404 program is no exception. So to get involved in this, the best way is to get on the email notification list from your state, from your agencies. In this case, it would be the Army Corps District, depending on where you are, and or your state agency. For things like 401 certification, you can sign up for notification directly from the state. It's important to know that the length of time that you have to comment on permits will vary with the different types of permits we covered, from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers 404 permit kind of proposal to 401 certification to your state wetland permit program, the isolated wetlands permit program. Each one of them allows a different amount of time. Remember that these general permits that we talked about are only open for comment when they're being drafted or renewed, not when someone applies for coverage. So it's really important, if you're concerned about some of the activities covered by those permits, that you're kind of in the loop and ready to comment when they come up. And of course, I've touched on this time and again, but your knowledge of the watershed might be really unique in terms of what an individual or general permit means where you live. Even the best intended, state employee or Army Corps employee can only know so much about this huge area they're covering. So never hesitate to share what you know about how a proposed activity could play out in your community. Generally speaking, I mentioned that these things vary, but for the Army Corps, usually they're going to allow 15 to 30 days for public comments, and you can get those notices either online or emailed. I've given the Huntington District public notice site here just an example, but I'll give you all of the districts at the end of the presentation. So getting in the loop on those is really important, because 15 days is not very long for public comment, and you'll need to be poised to respond quickly. Here's an example of a public notice. I think this is from the Huntington District. So this is the type of thing you'll see. This is just the front page. Of course, there's more attached to it, but these kind of general announcements come out quite regularly. You'll see it'll tell you, what water body they're looking at, when the comments close, and then start in on some of the specifics of the project and what is being proposed. So this is what you'll see if you get online or sign up for email notices. In terms of the Ohio program, public notice varies depending on those levels of review that I mentioned in the chart. So level 1 review is just a general permit. You can only comment on that, specifically on the permit when it comes out for renewal. But if it's a level 2 or level 3 review, you do get the chance for an actual public comment period on the specific proposal. You can see that the time varies. And I've provided here a link to the person, Chris Bowman, who can set you up with automatic public notices on the state's program specifically. For 401 certification, it's kind of similar to your state isolated wetlands program, and that is published in the newspapers, and it will be sent to interested parties. You can sign up for emails. And again, you get a little more time than you do generally with the Army Corps. You get 30 days for public comment, a little more if there's a public hearing held. And here I've provided a link to the website where you can sign up to, well, where you can see public notices, and then you can request to sign up for emailed versions. So those are the three kind of programs, the Army Corps, the Isolated Wetlands Program at the state, and then this 401 certification effort at the state level. Joe, I don't know if there would be any questions on that or if that's okay.
Yeah, I wanted to, it sounds like whether or not a project is going to fall under a general permit or not is pretty important in terms of the public's ability to review and maybe challenge aspects of a project. So I'm wondering, in that step when a project is submitting requests to fall under the general permit, is there an opportunity at that stage for members of the public to say challenge whether or not it should fall under a general permit, or is that entirely under the purview of the Corps?
There is a mechanism that will always allow a member of the public to request an individual permit for an activity. I would have to follow up to give you the regulatory site. I don't know it off the top of my head, but it's in the national regulatory structure that you can always require an individual permit, and there's, I believe, like a list of several things to be considered, including the fact that these general permits are supposed to cover activities that are of minimal environmental harm. So basically making the case that it's more than minimal. The challenge is knowing when someone has applied under the general permit for coverage. This is not public noticed. In some places and in some states, the agency will post, say on their website, there's been they're called a notice of intent filed to be covered under this general permit. And you at least get a chance to see who's applying, and you could then weigh in with the state agency and say, we think this is an inappropriate project for coverage under the general permit. So you can start by checking to see if those notices of intent are available. The only other way to really be aware if your agency, whether it's the state or the Corps, isn't providing that kind of information, is to have a good relationship with your regulatory agency and talk to them on a regular basis about what kinds of projects are being proposed, so that you get a chance to kind of challenge the idea that this project is a general permit type of activity. Again, making that case that it's more than minimal environmental impact, that there's a need for public input, those kinds of factors. So sometimes if you have a good relationship, and let's say, I'm going to use my local watershed, let's say, I really care about the Jordan River here in Utah. If I'm working closely with a regulatory agency staff person and they see a proposal come in, they might say, I should talk to Merritt about this before we approve coverage under the general permit, and just see if there's going to be any issues. But it's pretty informal, and otherwise it's hard to know when these general permits are being used. It's not a great answer, but does that cover it, Joe?
Yeah, and I think it highlights the importance of building that relationship with your EPA or your, in our case, Ohio EPA,
yeah.
404 permitting review folks.
Right. This is a little more intermediate, but a couple other ideas is, if you engage with the Army Corps and when they're developing, or your state agency, the Category 1 wetlands, to help them draft a good general permit, one of the things is, defining what activities can be covered and, limiting the size of projects that are acceptable. For example, the nationwide permits, almost all of them have some kind of a limitation. Say 300 feet of stream bank could be altered under this general permit. If it's more, you need to get an individual. So if you're involved in the development of those kinds of design things, you can kind of systematically make sure that there's a smaller footprint before they're even considering applying. And then the 401 water quality certification, if your state does review even the general permit applications, it gives at least a chance to weigh in when an individual project is proposed. That's a little more, that's something we could cover in a 401 webinar.
Okay. Good.
All right. Well, then just to wrap up in terms of more information and engagement, we've talked about most of the engagement ideas here, but just to highlight, for someone working at the watershed or local level, again, connecting with your local Corps office, the district, for public notices is pretty fundamental. And I would suggest that working with Ohio EPA on the 401 certifications and your isolated wetland program, getting those public notices and just being aware of what's being proposed in the watershed is key. And to the extent possible, commenting on individual permits as they come out. And if you have general permits that are an issue in your watershed, at least tracking the use of those general permits can be a key role for watershed groups. Getting at the last bullet, which is looking at the cumulative impacts of these kinds of decisions for a particular place. That again, even the best state agency and or Army Corps district is going to have a real challenge doing in any consistent manner. Something the watershed groups can really take on. So just those are the highlights probably of engagement. All easier said than done, but getting a handle on some of these issues will give you a really good understanding of what's really happening in terms of alterations in the watershed. And to help you do that, this is a slide that summarizes some of the websites we've already touched on for Ohio specifically. I have one that's a little more general in terms of national resources. But this is a list of websites that will help you connect with the Isolated Wetlands Permitting Program, your 401 certification program, and then something we didn't get to talk about a lot, which is the Mitigation Banking Program or approach of the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. So we talked about just the fact that there's some real challenges with mitigation. Spending some time with the Ohio DNR site will give you a feel for what specifically is being tried in Ohio. So those are some Ohio examples. This is a list of the core districts in Ohio and their website. Again, this is where you can see those public notices and figure out how to sign up for public notices, hopefully emailed to you directly. Again, the Huntington district covers the majority of the state, but the Buffalo, Louisville, and Pittsburgh districts are going to be important for some of you. And then lastly here, if we have any more questions, Joe, I'll just do them when we leave this slide up. This is some of the more general national resources if you want to take what we covered in the 101 and take it to the next level. We have an online course that covers the Clean Water Act more generally that's free for people to use. And we also have an owner's manual to the Clean Water Act, which is kind of a written version of that online course. EPA has a great webinar series that covers a lot of issues, including some wetland issues and some more advanced topics on wetlands and stream alteration. And then this last link is a collection of the federal regulations that relate to the wetlands issues we've talked about today, because I've thrown out a lot of citations, etc. This is a great collection if you're needing to look up anything. So with that, Joe, any last questions before we wrap it up?
Not so much a question, but a comment on the mitigation, and maybe this is something if we do a follow-up, we'll focus on more. But in terms of mitigation, that is one of those areas where local watershed groups can get very involved in helping EPA and the Corps identify opportunities. When a project does get permitted and when there is going to be some kind of an impact on the resource and they are going to be required to do mitigation, watershed groups can help EPA and the Corps identify good opportunities for mitigation within the watershed where the permit is or where the project is happening that's requiring the mitigation. So I think that's something that
great point. Yeah,
groups need to be aware of.
That is a really good point, Joe. I think I tend to focus a little bit on, the concerns about the success of mitigation and is it really, skipping ahead to that step. But on the positive side, it is a great role for watershed groups because you're going to have information and skills to, instead of just poking holes in, all the problems with mitigation, to actually try to make it work in your watershed. So that's a great point.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Merritt, again for doing this seminar. I think it's a great overview of a very complicated part of the Clean Water Act, but such an important one for people who are out there working on watershed protection to be aware of and know where they can get involved and how. So thanks again for being willing to present for us.
No, thank you for having me, and I hope folks are empowered instead of intimidated by the 404 program. It is a great tool for wetlands groups,
Yeah.
watershed groups.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, Joe.